I ask, how has the Republican Party come to this? I'm going to spend hardly any time describing how dark and abnormal what the Republican Party now is. We can look at the nature of the person who's about to become the Republican nominee for president. We can look at some of the really shameful things that the Republican dominated Supreme Court has done. We could look at the House of Representatives, the sole part of the uh, elected branches of our government that is under the control of the Republican Party, and see what a atrocious thing it has been. Just to name one thing, that they're withholding the funding for the Ukrainians right now. But there's such a long list of things that could be shown. I've been looking at this transformation for over 30 years, and really full time since 2004. What had been a respectable party that was a usual mixture of virtues and principles and defects and corruptions, the usual thing that we see in the human world where power is being dealt with. The normal political party of a previous time has been transformed into something where it becomes very, very difficult, maybe even impossible, to find any place where something better is happening because of the things that this party is saying or doing. I'm going to instead focus on the question, how did it become this? How did the Republican Party of a previous time, certainly of Eisenhower's era, even in Nixon's era, even in Reagan's and the first Bush, a normal party, become what this party is? I find the answer in looking at what were the major forces of brokenness in the century between the end of the Civil War and the middle of a century later, in the middle of the 1960s. I would say that if one had asked about that century of American life, the two major forces of brokenness operating in the society then of the United States were divided between the two major political parties. On the one hand, the Democratic Party, from before the Civil War all the way through to the mid-1960s, there was the force of brokenness of white supremacy. It was the force of brokenness that animated the slave power. It was the force of brokenness that continued to find its home in the Democratic Party during the era of Jim Crow, where the freed slaves were again subjugated, but under a regime of racial domination and oppression and even terror, thousands of lynchings. They had their home in the Democratic Party, as they had since the time where John C. Calhoun was with the force of nullification, where the battle over whether slavery's empire would be allowed to continue, and leading into the Civil War. And the other major force of brokenness, by which I mean a power that kept America from living up to its ideals of justice, was housed in the Republican Party, and this was a force of essentially corporate greed. In the wake of the Civil War, in the wake of the assassination of President Lincoln, the Republican Party became the major political instrument of the burgeoning force of corporate capitalism. They were talking about the age of the robber barons. We're talking about the age of U.S. Steel and Standard Oil and the railroad tycoons. They had as their major political instrument in the American power system the Republican Party. They appointed, in the generations after the Civil War, they appointed the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court handed down decisions that blocked the ability of labor to organize so that they could deal with the massive giant powers of the corporate system on an equal footing. Labor was prevented from organizing, all the way up into the New Deal. But they were in two different parties. The force of white supremacy was in the Democratic Party. The force of corporate greed was in the Republican Party. And even though each of them succeeded in major ways in making America more broken than it might otherwise have been, they also substantially canceled each other out because they were on different sides, and the battle for power in the American power system was between these two parties. And they were kept, these two major forces of brokenness canceled each other out because their instruments were opposed to each other. Then in the mid-1960s, the movement in the Democratic Party to achieve racial justice, working substantially with what had been the party of Lincoln on the issue of race. The Democratic president in 1965 signed major civil rights legislation that announced the end of the segregated South, the Jim Crow South. And when Lyndon Johnson signed that legislation, this Democratic Party is reported to have said that the Democratic Party had lost the South for a generation. He underestimated. Starting with Nixon's campaign in 1968, which used what they called a Southern strategy, the Republicans began to become the home of the force of white supremacy, the political power wielded by the white people of the former Confederacy. And gradually, what had been the solid Democratic South gradually became the solid Republican South. Major Democratic figures like Strom Thurmond became Republicans. He had been the Dixiecrat nominee for president in 1948 because the Democratic Party was already with Truman seeking to integrate the military of the United States. And other important Republican figures moved from the Democratic Party, where they had gotten their start and even been elected to the Senate, like Senator Shelby of Alabama and Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi. They moved into the Republican Party. The significance of that movement was not visible to many people, or actually, I don't know that it was visible to anybody. I only figured this out a few years ago. If you go to my website, a betterhumanstory.org and search for has the Republican Party come to this, you'll find an op-ed that was published just 2 years ago that I wrote that ran in the red congressional district where I was the Democratic nominee in 2011-12 in that election of 2012. What happened was not just that the Democrats lost the South, but the Republican Party that had been the place where the force of corporate greed has been housed for a century, now was the house of white supremacy as well. And these two major forces of brokenness that had somewhat canceled each other out during that century of political power struggle between the two major parties. Now both of those forces of brokenness were housed under the tent of one party. The Republican Party that had been a mixture of, let's just say, constructive and destructive, virtuous and corrupt elements, like the Democratic Party had been, and the Republican Party that had been able to be a normal party, a respectable party, now had its normal and respectable components opposed by two forces that no longer canceled each other out, but formed an alliance within that Republican tent. And the normal and respectable elements were being overpowered now by the alliance of these two powerful things that had formerly been on different sides of the political arena. That led to the takeover of the entire Republican Party, of elements that never before would have been able to be so prominent in the Republican world. Eventually, you get a party that's run by people who form a rogues gallery, in a sense. The last Republican presidential, that's not correct. John McCain and Mitt Romney were people who had formed under a normal and respectable Republican Party, but they both had to pretty much sell their souls and to get the nomination. They had to embrace things that they presumably knew were not okay. Political ambition does that to people. But by the time you get to the George W. Bush presidency, the first Bush presidency was the last normal Republican presidency. George W. Bush's presidency, wielding power with not just Bush the son, but Karl Rove, Dick Cheney, and then eventually the next Republican presidency was Donald Trump's. This is a party in which white racism and corporate greed could form an alliance to take the Republican Party into a very dark place. And that's my best explanation of how it is that the Republican Party has become something which is pretty close to unprecedented in its consistently working to make the human world worse. Maybe you could look at the Democratic Party of the 1850s and find something similar. The Whig Party had broken apart over the issue of slavery. And the party of the Republican Party that became the party of Lincoln in 1860 rose up to take its place. And the Civil War came out of the brokenness of the Democratic Party that was so much enthralled to the slave power that even Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's opponent in the race for the Senate in 1858, was not pro-slavery enough. And the Democratic Party broke apart too in that election of 1860 and opened the door to Abraham Lincoln becoming the President of the United States. And the force of the slave power was so strong that in the region of the slave empire, that they could lawlessly secede and create a civil war. But in any event, the Republican Party, when it became dominated by the alliance of the former slave powers spirit and the corporate greed spirit, became something darker and more destructive than we'd ever seen in a major American political party. That's the best answer I've been able to come up with about how did the Republican Party come to this. Thank you.